So let's move on to cellular foundations. Remember that when we're talking about life and living organisms, we classify them into 3 different distinct domains, those being bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So these 3 main branches of domains is what we focus on all of the living organisms. And within those domains, there are 6 kingdoms of life. So if you go back here, you can see that these domains, there are branches within them, and we can categorize the domains a little bit further. There's generally archaea, which we classify as being unicellular and prokaryote. We'll again review what that prokaryote means. Bacteria, also unicellular and prokaryote. Protista, unicellular but eukaryote cellular organization. Fungi can actually be uni or multicellular, but they're all eukaryotic. And then we look at the plant, multicellular eukaryotic, and animal multicellular eukaryotic. So remember where these kingdoms fit into those domains. But generally, we're going to be talking about the difference of how these types of organisms are organized as far as, again, how cellular they are, if they're uni or multicellular, or if they're prokaryote and eukaryote, and what that means. We talk a lot about the cell because the cell is generally the universal building block of most all life. Living organisms are made of cells, and even the simplest living organisms are still unicellular, so they're still just a cell. Larger organisms are, of course, multicellular, where they have different functions for different cells within the whole of the organism. Cells have common features, but they contain unique components per organism and per type of cell. As I brought up in a previous slide, there are 2 main types of cell that we see in all of life, and those are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are cells that we generally define as not having a membrane-bound nuclei, whereas eukaryotics do. So this is the main difference. I've underlined it because it is very important. Prokaryotes do not have a membrane around their nuclei, eukaryotes do. So as I said, these cells share common features. Here I'm showing you a bacteria cell versus an animal cell. So remember, bacterial cells are a type of prokaryotic cell, and animal cells are a type of eukaryotic cell. You can see that they both share having a cytoplasm. They both have a plasma membrane, that's a membrane around the outside of the cell. They both have ribosomes. Ribosomes are very important components because they are the machines to make more proteins. Now notice here one distinct difference, as I just pointed out, the animal cell has a nucleus, membrane bound, where its genetic information is, whereas the bacteria cell has what we call a nucleoid. The nucleoid is just the free-floating DNA that is not contained by a membrane. And animal cells or eukaryotic cells also have organelles that are usually membrane bound as well, whereas prokaryotic cells typically do not. These organelles are just free-floating within the cytoplasm. The prokaryote is very simple. It's usually single-celled organism, and again, it lacks a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Both bacteria and archaea are classified as prokaryotes. So I'm talking about bacteria a lot here. Bacteria is a type of organism that is a prokaryote, but Don't forget that archaea are also classified as prokaryotes. The majority of the prokaryotic DNA is just found in that central region. Again, as you can see in our picture here, the scribbly line is where that prokaryotic DNA is within the entirety of the cell. And again, this is called a nucleoid. It's typically consisting of single loops of circular chromosomes. This is a kind of key point many of you maybe don't know. We'll actually be bringing this up again when we talk about bacteria, and also in lab when we're talking about genetic modification. We tend to use prokaryotic cells in biochemical experiments to make things for us, or when we're studying them. And it's important to understand that they have these circular chromosomes. So DNA in its chromosomal form is actually in a loop. When we break down the prokaryotic cell into its structure, you can see the general components, their composition, and their function. I'm bringing up the composition here. This is a pretty important piece to note, because when we start talking about building blocks later in the semester, I want you to be able to recognize the building blocks of lipids and proteins and carbohydrates and how they're actually put together to compose these structures. We know, of course, the cell wall, which gives that mechanical support around the outside of the cell. This is made of carbohydrates or sugars and protein. And the combination and type of carbohydrate and protein is very important for bacteria cells. Cell membrane, which is composed of lipid and protein. The nucleoid itself, remember, is that DNA, but there are also proteins there. In a chromosomal form, DNA is wrapped up. It's not just kind of floating as a single strand of DNA. It's still coiled and wrapped in that loop, and proteins are actually helping to keep it coiled. If you remember, those proteins are actually called histones. Ribosomes, remember, ribosomes are what make our proteins, and they are composed of RNA and protein. Pili help with adhesion to things. So they sometimes look like small pieces along the outside of the bacteria, and I'll show you that on this picture. You can see these little pieces coming off of the exterior of the protein are a type of pili. And again, they help with adhesion to either other bacteria cells or other cells, or just other structures. Flagella, not all prokaryotic cells have flagella, but generally they have some sort of structure made of protein that helps with their motility, their ability to move around. And then the cytoplasm is technically a structure. We don't really think of it as a structure very often because it's, usually just thought of the solution that exists within the cell, but it is the site of metabolism, and there are components in the cytoplasm that are very important. So it's still considered a structure, just like we sometimes forget to think about our skin as an actual organ. The cytoplasm is a structure of the cell. Prokaryotic cells are very small. They are the smallest of the cells, although they are still larger than a virus. You can see on our scale here, this is a log scale, so everything looks very close together, but each of these notches along the plot actually represent a very, very big jump in size. So you can see the actual mitochondria organelle, which we see found in animal cells and plant cells, is actually almost as big as an entire bacteria itself. So bacteria and prokaryotic cells are very small, but again, the flu virus and viruses in general are much, much smaller. They only comprise of a very, very, very small amount of structural components compared to something like bacteria. And you can see that there's another whole jump as we go from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells like plants and animal cells. So let's now review eukaryotic cells in comparison to our prokaryotic friends. These are the more complex cells, and they are made, they make up things like plants and fungi and animals. So again, as I showed in that original diagram talking about the different domains of life and the different kingdoms, eukaryotic cells exist within numerous kingdoms of life. Again, the main component that makes them eukaryotic compared to prokaryotic is that they have a membrane-bound nucleus. This is an area that protects the DNA. It's also the site of DNA metabolism. The membrane itself is important because it's selective. It allows import and export only via these membrane pores. Eukaryotic cells also have membrane-enclosed organelles, things like mitochondria for energy, or in plants, chloroplast, also for energy, but plant-specific, and lysosomes, an area of digestion for unneeded molecules. These are all specific organelles that have an enclosed membrane within the cell. Eukaryotic organisms can be unicellular. Many people forget that. They think, oh, eukaryotics are always associated with complex beings like people or plants and animals. But we do have unicellular eukaryotes. One of the best examples of this is yeast. Yeast is a eukaryotic organism, but it is unicellular. So while prokaryotics are always unicellular organisms, eukaryotics can be unicellular or multicellular. Here's an example of an animal cell. Here we're comparing and contrasting animal and plant cells because even though they are both eukaryotic type cells, within the cell types, we actually have unique components as well. And it's important to talk about these distinct things because we'll be bringing up plants and animal cells throughout the semester and kind of comparing and contrasting the biochemistry that's happening within these cells. Because of the unique components, there is different chemistry that occurs. So here you can see most of these organelles are pretty typical of a eukaryotic cell. Ribosomes in general are shared across eukaryotic cells, the nucleus and nuclear envelope where we have our DNA, plasma membrane, the rough ER and smooth ER, Golgi, peroxisomes. Now, one thing that is different here in red highlighted is a lysosome. Lysosomes are areas that degrade into cellular debris, and these are very specific to animal type cells. Now, when we look at a plant cells utilize all of the organelles except for the lysosomes that we just looked at in the animal cells, but they have some unique cellular components that you do not find in animal cells. One thing I will bring up, a lot of people like to contrast, plant cells have chloroplast where they make their energy, and animal cells do not have chloroplast. They make their energy in the mitochondria. These are the powerhouses, right? Plant cells still do have mitochondria, so don't forget plant cells also utilize mitochondria and they have chloroplast. So mitochondria is shared between these eukaryotic cells. Chloroplast is unique to plant cells. Plant cells can have things like starch granules. This is where they store carbohydrates. Glycoloids, this is the actual site of light-driven energy synthesis. The cell wall itself. So cell wall is one very distinct difference between a plant and animal cell. This is an exterior membrane, the wall, which is very rigid and protects the cell from swelling. Plant cells have vacuoles, which are an area to degrade and recycle molecules. So this is kind of similar to the lysosomes, but again, this is unique to plant cells versus animal cells. Glycosomes, we'll be talking about glycosomes much later in the semester, but again, good to refresh and remember these are areas for the glycolate cycle. Again, this is biochemistry 2 when we talk about metabolism and cycles, but remember that this is a special organelle that plants have. So if we were to make a Venn diagram, which I have done here, comparing plant and animal, you can see the organelles they both have: membranes, nucleus, mitochondria, rough and smooth ER, ribosomes, Golgi, cytoskeleton. Animals specifically have lysosome and peroxisomes, and plants specifically have chloroplast, vacuoles, glycosomes, plasmodesma, and cell walls. So we've kind of overviewed cells and the biological component of our biochemistry. But remember that cells are also complex in a sense because they are made up of small molecules. We can think of the cell itself being made up of these organelles, these supramolecular complexes like the cell wall and the plasma membrane. But then even those are made up of macromolecules like DNA and protein and cellulose. And those macromolecules are technically made up of even smaller units, those monomeric units, nucleotides, amino acids, and sugars. This is a reminder that most of the biology in this unit is going to be comprised of small molecule chemistry.